It's a pleasure to be able to present to the ISC today. I very much wish I could be there in person. It turns out that I am actually on an airplane at the time that you will be watching this presentation. But I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you some thoughts briefly about the work I've done with Jonathan Hope and others, how we end up thinking about Shakespeare's plays when we have the ability to count things in them. I'd like to share my screen here and begin with a few words. The words that we'll be discussing today are if, and, or but, and I hope over the course of this it'll become clear why. But I did want to just start with some interesting developments. There are people who are now trying to train machine learning algorithms and neural nets to write like Shakespeare and perhaps even to write new works or complete sonnets or other things. No doubt that will continue, and maybe we will be fooled by a algorithmically generated Shakespeare sonnet, but that is not what I want to talk about today. I actually want to talk about something a lot more basic, maybe, in terms of the computational power involved, but also I think illustrative. So what I wanted to do today was to call your attention to the words if, and, or but. That's a memorable trio, and what we can learn about Shakespeare's plays by paying attention to them. So the work that I'm presenting and the thinking I'm presenting comes with the assistance of some tools that were created with funding from the Mellon Foundation at the Madison, Wisconsin project, Visualizing Early Print, which has, among other things, some great collections of texts, both modernized and original, that you can use to count things. But in this case, this is just an experiment on Shakespeare, 36 plays. The texts that I'm using are the Folger editions. Not surprising. I have eliminated the speech prefixes and the stage directions because in this experiment, I just like to think about what's being said. So this screen is a tool that I've used and Jonathan Hope and I have used, which allows us to identify a feature set, and a feature is something that you can count. It needs to be very specific so that the machine will start counting and count things and then stop. But you can do that. And in this case, we picked these three words. So those are featured on the left. And you see that I've highlighted the words but and if. And then in the text to the right, I can see in context where those words occur. It's one thing to count things. It's another to go back to the context and ask yourself what those words are doing. But one result of this type of experiment is that you end up with a spreadsheet. And on this spreadsheet are 36 plays by Shakespeare in rows, and then some columns. And each of those columns is a measurement of the percentage of the words in that play that are the feature in question. So what's the percentage of Othello that is the word if, or but, or and? So those three measurements are taken by counting those features in a digitized text, and then they are recorded. Once you have measured those things, you can then compare them. And I am going to compare them in something that I will call an if, and, or but space. This is an abstract space in which each of the plays is rated on the percentage of words or tokens in that play that are the features if, and, or but. And I'm not going to go and try and rotate this space for you, but I'm going to ask you to take my word for it when I say that once we put these measurements in space, the 36 plays do seem to cluster or stand apart from each other in some interesting ways. So we decided, or I decided in this experiment, to color code the plays using the catalog page of the first folio. So we have two people who knew Shakespeare, Hemmings and Condell, who have made a judgment, and it's got a lot of information in it. They've drawn a circle around three groups of texts. And when I add that information to the diagram by coloring the dots, each of which is a play, I actually allow you to see potentially the different distribution of these features. So I've subjected the counts on these plays to statistical tests. And one of the things that appears to be not a chance result, but significant, is the following. So first, plays that have a lot of and with respect to the mean in the group tend to lack or have less than the mean of the words if and but. And those plays that have those characteristics also tend to be what we think of as history plays. So that grouping on the basis of those measurements doesn't feel chancy. And that's a statistical test. So conversely, plays having a lot of if and but, they tend to lack and. So if you're a play and you've got a lot of if and but, you will have comparatively less and. Also, if you are one of those, you will tend to be what we think of as comedies, or what Hemmings and Condell labeled comedies. So that feels descriptive to me in the sense that once we stabilized what we're counting and once we specified the texts involved, once we found some labels for our groups, which it's more useful that I didn't supply them. It was two historical figures who did. Then it's possible to ask, is there anything statistically significant about how these different features vary with respect to each other and with respect to these groups? So this is not something that you or I, maybe you, but I could never have come up with this by reading. It will also be stable. If you agree that these are the features and these are the texts that count as Shakespeare, if you agree that these are comedies and these are histories and tragedies, these findings shouldn't change. So they shouldn't change. But we also need to explain them. And so I wanted to provide a sample interpretive gesture, which will say something about why those features distribute in that way and across those groups. And here is my provisional interpretation. If you're telling a story about frustrated courtship, you're going to be staging a drama of conditions. That's a drama of, let's say, reticence or confusion, where some hidden objection or fear is being hidden or displaced. If you said that you loved me, I would agree, but you didn't. Now, that's a gross paraphrase, but I'm trying to sum up some of the feints and evasions that are characteristic of two-person erotic dialogue. And the second of longing, which is more counterfactual. If this were true, and I don't think it is, but if it were, or I hope that it might be true, then this other thing would be true. So if you're a comedy, you need words such as if and but in order to advance this type of two-person action, which has a mutual understanding or misunderstanding or frustration that needs to be sustained for at least 4 acts. And the process of sustaining that kind of confused attraction requires you to use some words more than others. So if you find that persuasive, and we could certainly debate it, it is useful then to go back to the texts, as Jonathan Hope and I frequently do, to just ask ourselves, is that what is happening? And I've picked this example. There are many more from As You Like It. And you can see in this final reveal scene, the characters, Duke Senior, Orlando, and Phoebe, are using if in exactly this way in order to say, I think this is not true, but also I hope this is true. And that particular mixture of contrary to fact thinking and longing feels like one of the great features of comic writing. But let's go back to the if and or but space and look at it again. One thing that I notice, and Hope and I have noticed this in many experiments where we counted other things besides if and or but, is that Othello almost always groups with the comedies. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. The first, though, most important, is that a critic has already identified that grouping. When Susan Snyder was writing about genre, one of her observations was that the play Othello, at least in terms of how the action plays out, is staged like a comedy. So you have sustained two-person erotic dialogue. In this case, the feints and allusions and reticence, which are so important to the seduction of Othello by Iago, are mimicking some of the same types of dynamics that we see in comic plotting. So if you have a look at this, this is from 3.3 in Othello. The label there is wrong. Just to repeat something that I think, if you consider it a while, feels like it makes sense. Othello, in the scenes in the middle of the play in Act 3, we are seeing the kind of almost courtship and seduction that is characteristic of comedy. And so when you want to do that, if you are Shakespeare and you're writing a play like that, you can't help but use the word if and but. And I think if is probably the more powerful feature in the pattern, but it's a way of, I'm going to say, redescribing a genre difference that you and I might describe in qualitative terms. A comedy is a play of erotic longing that is frustrated and that results in a marriage. But much more disturbingly, Othello is a play of seduction, which uses many of the features of comic writing and plotting, but uses them to appall, amaze, and disturb us. So maybe this also is one of the reasons why Othello is so difficult and unnerving. In addition to the plot and the issues raised by the plot, you have this contrary to genre footwork that is being danced in the language. So I wanted to conclude with this. There is a lot of computing power that exists already. There will be more. And as successive experiments and approaches are deployed on the texts of Shakespeare, and indeed the entire record of what was written in the early modern period, and as much as it has survived, I think there'll be more and more claims. And so I wanted to conclude with this because I think it's important to have some self-awareness about what we are saying when we count things and then say that they suggest a conclusion. So I wanted to differentiate between a feature, which is an item that can be addressed and counted in a text. And these feel empirically real because you can say what they are, you can count them, and at a certain point after counting, you'll have to stop because there's a specific amount of it. And that really does feel unchangeable and empirical if you agree that the features that you've selected and the texts that you've identified, or even the groupings like comedy, history, and tragedy, once you make those decisions, these findings will remain stable. But that's very different from the kind of claim I made when I started to talk about comic plotting and the kind of dialogue that's required. In that case, I was taking a finding, or let's say a description of the feature set and how it distributes over some groups. And I was saying that that is a proxy for something that you and I already know or should look into. It's a way of almost baptizing an empirical finding and presenting it as something that is, and I'm not saying that it's dishonest, it's actually exactly what we do when we argue about texts. You're taking a feature, in the case of the work that you and I usually do, it's probably a passage, and you are pointing to it and saying, this is a proxy or a stand-in, or it's evidence for a pattern that you and I have discussed or understand. Let's say it's comedy or genre. But it's important to say that someone has to do that. And I think you would probably be more likely to agree with the counting of the features. Well, you're right, there's this much in this play and this much in that play, and you're right, this is not a chance grouping here. That's harder to argue with, but absolutely, we should be arguing with the conclusion about how that distribution and those features seem to add up to the way in which Shakespeare writes comedy as Hemmings and Condell identified it. So features are easier to identify. Sometimes they're arbitrarily identified. Sometimes it's motivated, and there's some interpretation there. But the arguments that follow, which are proxy arguments, are absolutely interpretive, and there are alternatives. And if those arguments are won or lost, it's probably because someone is persuaded by the example. And that's exactly how we persuade each other when we are doing literary criticism. I'm grateful for the chance to speak with you, and I really wish that we could talk more about this. It's been a real pleasure to present to this group, and I hope that everyone has a great, great conference.